Hello and welcome to Deep Impact, a deep dive into Wildbow's most unloved work 5 years on. These words are ours for us alone, and nothing we say on this podcast is meant to be binding. Coming up next is Elliot Diebold.
And that was Ruben Morehouse.
And we are here to talk about the first interlude of Pact, Bonds 1.x. So Elliot, did you think that Pact would have interludes as well when you started diving into it?
I did already know it was going to have interludes, but I mean, this is already, unless I'm blanking on an example, nothing in Parahumans has had a series of diary entries. Like, this is already cool and different.
Yeah, I mean, diary entries are the practitioner equivalent of an online message board, I think.
yeah, true. But no, this was really cool and different, and in a lot of ways is exactly what I love about what Wildbow does with the interludes in Parahumans. I loved this chapter, and I'm keen to see however many more interludes there are in Pact.
Yeah. 16 or whatever, or I guess there's bonus ones too. So it's interesting because this interlude, I mean, we're going to do our plot summary, but the plot of this story really isn't important at all. The plot of this interlude. There are a few important things, but it's mainly about just kind of getting the atmosphere and the vibe of the life of Rose Senior, this is her diary. Would you agree with that, Elliot?
Yeah, I would say that everything, this is even meant to be a set of sort of cherry-picked diary entries, and what has sort of been picked are the ones that, have to do with Rose Senior, or explaining the important parts of Rose Senior and her character to us.
Yeah, kind of the pivotal moments in her life that led her to have the collection of worldviews that she displays at the very start of this chapter.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. She's just had a whole chapter dedicated to her, and I still feel like there's so much more that I want to see. And she's been so important to things so far. I have a feeling that the legacy of Rose Senior is still going to be a very important part for a lot longer in this book. So I'm keen to see even more of Rose Senior.
Yeah, it's not a spoiler to say that Pact is Wildbow's shortest story,
Yeah.
And there definitely is this feeling of like, I just want more. I just want to know more about this world. I just want to see more people in it,
Yeah.
Anyway, I can't explain that too much without going into spoiler territory, so we better start the plot summary. This interlude is basically collected pages from Rose Senior's diary, starting off with one when she is 8 years old, or very young. I think it's specified 8 years old.
It isn't, but the other ones are 8 years later, and they specify that she's 16. So right. I sort of went back and edited the notes to say 8 because it's something we kind of learn later.
Yep, makes sense. So we are in the story. Rose is basically describing how she was tricked by somebody called Paige to kind of be tricked into this, shed or something, and basically beaten up by a bunch of kids.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've said multiple times throughout this podcast that Rose Senior is a dick for not introducing everyone to this world earlier. But this chapter seems, the first half of this chapter at least seems purpose-built to call out that philosophy and say, no, actually, being integrated into this world so early on kind of fucks you up.
Yeah, and we'll specifically call attention to why she didn't indoctrinate her children later on. But
yeah,
I do love the idea of Rose, being 8 years old and basically existing in this world, not awakened, but still kind of in danger,
Yeah.
Just because of people, not necessarily because of others. And so her dad has basically told her to memorize a phrase phonetically, which is, "With this bloodshed I pay you, Furfur, exact my revenge." To call out to a demon in case things go bad for her, right? Man,
good parenting.
We're off on a wild start already.
And I mean, I just love the way the dad, when she recounts her dad telling her this phrase, his exact sort of comment afterwards was like, I mean, Furfur shows up, you probably won't be that much worse off. Like, use it when you think you might die, because, with Furfur, you won't be that much worse off. And it's still like, use this when you think you're about to die, and hopefully things won't get much worse for you. It's just, it's not things a normal 8-year-old has to really consider.
I don't think the demon's name is actually Furfur. I think that's just Rose misremembering or misinterpreting what her dad has told her.
Yeah, I mean, it could be. But then also there's one called Arse Pint, so, sensible names doesn't seem to be a requirement to be a demon. Sure. So, basically, after this, Rose kind of... Oh, she says this, and nothing really happens, but the kids all run away. She's kind of scared them off. And she runs to tell her dad what happened, and we basically see, through her eyes, her dad going out to steal some hair from Paige. And we don't ever really find out what he's done with it, but we do find out that one of Paige's parents, presumably, or family members, has come to kind of negotiate a ceasefire with Rose's dad. There's this great bit where Rose's dad gives back the piece of hair, and whichever Duchamp is meeting with Rose's dad says something along the lines of, "Is this all the hair? How can I trust you?" And Rose's dad says, "Well, you can't." So tough shit. And it's also horrifying because this seems like something like having one of the daughters beaten and then presumably an adult male going and finding the other 8-year-old girl and cutting off all her hair. This seems like a family feud ripe for escalation, and yet they're willing to call everything to a halt just to get the hair back, which just implies to me that there's some terrible thing associated with him having her hair that I don't even think I want to know what that means, but it's so great and spooky. And I mean, this whole first set of diary entries where Rose is so young really just feels like Wildbow's having fun with, a kid's perspective on this fucked up world. Like, she's got that thing that the kids have where they're aware that there's like tension or what emotions are happening, but she doesn't really understand why. Like, she's like, oh, everyone's tense about the hair. That's kind of strange. And of course, like, I'm sitting here being like, oh, Jesus, what does that mean?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of this thing where, like, if with like racism in the US, or even if like families have a kind of falling out, their kids will grow up knowing, hey, we're meant to hate these people, but they never really know why, and it kind of leads to this system of the kind of propagation of these weird rivalries. And we'll kind of get to that a bit later, I think. But one other thing I want to call out, I think
Wildbow does a good job of capturing that sort of perceptiveness but ignorance that kids kind of have. And just another little thing that I think is worth mentioning: all of these early chapters are filled with little spelling errors. Which really it's just a nice little detail that sells that this is the diary of an 8-year-old. Like, she spells dangerous with a J, little phonetic mistakes like that, which just, it's just a sensible little detail that was nice to see.
Yeah. It really gives you this vibe of like kids say the darndest things, but about demons. So one other thing I want to point out from this section before we kind of time skip forward is, her dad shows this one small moment of compassion, right? Where he kind of carries her to bed and holds her while she's crying. And I'll quote here, "He told me the deal was I was allowed to cry, but only so long as it was night and my head was on the pillow. In daylight, I cannot cry or show weakness." And this, I think, really sets up something that is so central to Rose's character, if not, just the idea of being a practitioner, which is the only way you can deal with all of these insane things, both human and other, is if you're consistently strong and show no weakness,
Yeah, and that's something we've been seeing in other parts of the story as well. But you're right; it really sort of puts some of Rose Senior's behavior into perspective. She was all about image.
Yeah, totally.
And then she just writes in her diary about how she isn't really able to make any friends at school because there's so many rules and everything's so tense. But it's okay now because since she did this weird thing with her dad, she can see all these tricky things around the house that want to be her friend.
Yeah. The idea of others reaching out to an 8-year-old girl saying, "Hey, come be my friend," is horrifying.
Yeah, Achiever calls out saying they're older than it. It's so fucked up, and I love it, and it ties so well into this theme. The theme of this chapter, which I think is largely like being a practitioner is so all encompassing. It's so all or nothing, and it happened to Rose so young, and so the fact that it's like, well, she doesn't have human friends, but it's okay because she's making friends with like goblins and demons and shit. That's fine. It also makes me worried for Blake and Rose.
It's just normal growing up.
It makes me worried for Blake and Rose in the present because are any of these things still in the house? Like, I don't know, it seems to be implied here that her dad and mum had a lot of spirits in the house, and I wonder if any of them are still around. So that'll be interesting to see.
So Rose has just awakened, and she's been playing with local others, and there's this kind of weird little collection of scenes where she first gets angry at an other called Arspint for cheating at some kind of game.
Yeah.
And is kind of complaining to her dad about how she never wins this game.
Yeah, and then he tells her to go hit the books to find out how to punish Arspine or get back at him, because that's very important. And this ties into that whole thing you were saying before about saving face, and how she's sort of being groomed for this. But yeah, so we then get another cut from like a few months ahead where she's managed to capture Arspine and she's plotting ways to punish him further.
Yeah, so the punishment that I think she kind of favors to give to him is making him agree to do a song and dance about how mangy and pathetic he is in comparison to her every time he meets somebody.
Yeah, which is
a great little childish punishment to give to another.
Oh, I love it because it's both so childish and silly, but also felt very practitioner-y to me. Like, that is also something that's sort of embarrassing that I could see, like that's going to hurt your reputation, which we've just been talking about how important that is. So that would really, the others would probably hate that. So like, and I think this is the last bit we get before we're about to jump 8 years ahead to when she's 16. And I think this is showing us that transition from her being just a kind of odd kid to really thinking like a practitioner, which is something she's doing a lot more after the time jump. Yeah,
even, she's only 9 years old, but she started thinking, granted childishly, but in the ways of a practitioner.
Yeah, exactly. And that jumps us ahead to when she's 16. And, so now she's at a religious boarding school in Montreal, and she's much more of a practitioner now. So she's actually, the plot for this whole section is really just that she's lost a book and she's trying to get it back. So she's at a religious boarding school. So this book that she's lost, it's never explicitly said, but presumably has a lot of things about, demons and shit like that. Yeah. And so the faculty finds it and basically starts freaking out that somebody is into witchcraft. I mean, they're right. Like,
totally.
We tend to hammer on people for, witch hunting and stuff in other pieces of work, but they're actually, the religious zealots in this school are right on the money, actually.
Yeah, they've actually gotten it right. So good on them, I guess. So Rose is trying to amass power with the kind of spirits that are around the school, but they're all quite weak. And so she's not able to build up enough power to go back to steal the book until it's too late. And another group of students has found out about it and taken it.
Yeah.
And so she goes to get the book back from these students, but finds them having sex and kind of is freaked out by this and runs away.
Her reaction to this is very interesting because she opens the bit by mocking the religious part of the school. She's like, religion. Yeah. And then she immediately calls out these people for having sex and being like, oh, that's something like a proper person doesn't do till marriage. Which is, sex, waiting for sex until marriage is something that's mostly affiliated with religion.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, I think the point of this was meant to be like sex is such a human thing, really. And I think it's just showing us how alienated she is from just being a normal person. Like the thought of seeing people engage in sex is just so confronting to her.
Yeah, I think this really is kind of so telling about Rose's character. It feels weird calling her Rose Senior. The young Rose Senior. You're right. She's just so distinct from the normal human world. And from being a 16-year-old girl.
And I love this bit. She sort of brings this up at the start of her letter. Like, she mentions that the reason she had the book out in the first place was because she didn't really have any friends. And then at the end of this diary entry as well, there's this other line where she says, "I wonder if being hated may be better than being a nobody," which just seems like a great TLDR for Rose Senior. Like, she would rather like the whole situation Blake has kind of found himself in with all these nukes that seems to have been largely her. It just screams of she would rather be hated than having achieved nothing and not be remembered. So I love this line as a summary of who she is, as I understand her so far.
It definitely kind of seems to sum up her character as we know it so far. So what happens next after Rose kind of runs away is something called the Lord of Montreal reaches out to Rose and basically tells her to sort it out because bad shit's going to happen otherwise.
Yeah.
Now, what do you think the Lord of Montreal is, Elliot?
Okay.
Putting you on the spot.
Yeah. So I remember, like from Laird's talk earlier in the arc, I think it was in Laird's talk, he sort of mentioned how when places like Jacob's Bell grow, and there forms like a bit of a stability, and I think there was talk then of there being like a lord or lady of the region. So presumably that's just what's happened in Montreal. Is that Montreal is what Jacob's Bell might look like once things grow and stabilize there. But I think there's a mention of the Lord of Montreal specifically being a merchant spirit who turned into a mortal and is now a god, which I don't really know what to make of any of that. Like some sort of other who got turned into a mortal so he could become a practitioner and got really good at it is my best guess. But I feel like I'm working on very little concrete information, and I'm drawing some pretty thick lines to attach those things.
You got to extrapolate out into the darkness.
Yeah.
So again, no comment on that. So we skip ahead a few days, and Rose is kind of at this point missed her chance to get the book back because the students were messing around with it and accidentally summoned a small demon. And we're now in the aftermath of this, and Rose is basically describing what has happened to her diary, which is that this demon came out and did something non-physical to a student called Minnie that has basically left her catatonic.
Yeah. And then obviously the other people who were there at the time using the book have sort of been blamed, and it's like for the first time Rose sort of sees how the world of practicing looks to normal people, which is just
to
like,
muggles we call them.
Pact, which is just they're just kind of like it must have been like the teenage boys, like they just find they just sort of use Occam's razor in a world where magic doesn't exist to just sort of blame people. And it's I don't know. It's weird because it strikes her as odd that they were so easily able to just pin it on someone who it obviously probably wasn't, just to make it make sense. Yeah,
there's this kind of cognitive dissonance where things have to make sense in the world where they don't understand that magic exists, and so it has to be something, so therefore this,
Yeah.
And Rose kind of reflects on how tragic it is that Minnie, the catatonic student, neither Minnie nor anybody, nor the men or anyone will ever really know what happened or why it happened. Like their lives are just forever broken by this, and they'll never know why.
She's very nervous about she thinks about this whole thing. Like, it was such a big part that broke so many lives, and nobody will really remember it. Like, Minnie's just kind of damaged. Yeah. The boys will probably just rewrite their own memories to make it make sense. Like the thought of it all being so ephemeral is terrifying to her.
Yeah, and I think this kind of ties back to Rose Senior being so driven and determined to succeed in this world, even at the cost of being hated. She sees the cost of failure from a young age, and she clearly doesn't want to end up damaged, I guess is how she would put it.
Yeah.
Like Minnie is. she doesn't want to be used up by this world. She wants to be something, even if that something is hated by other people.
Yes, and I think that ties perfectly into what happens in the next diary entry where she returns home. But this opens with her being greeted by her mum. And then after her mum leaves, she has a big fight with her father, basically about how early she was awakened. And it ties back into what you were just saying about her revelation about Minnie. Like she doesn't like who she is because she was in this world so early.
And she swears an oath that she will keep her children out of this life, which contextualizes some stuff.
It also serves as a great example of why someone that young shouldn't have been awoken, because they're liable to say dumb stuff like that when they're emotional.
And then be held to it for the rest of their life.
Yeah. I mean, I guess she doesn't really go into the exact phrasing she uses, I don't think, but it doesn't really explain why she couldn't get her grandkids ready, but that's fine. Anyway, she runs away. But I wanted to circle back to that bit about Rosa's mother, because I thought that was super interesting, because in all the other diary entries, her mum is absent, like traveling to get books and stuff. She's building this library, which presumably Rose uses later in her life, but that's not covered in these chapters. But
I think it's fair to assume that this is the library that they've inherited, and now this is kind of part of the house.
Yeah, definitely. And presumably it was vital to creating these nukes that Rose Senior has made. But I love this encounter with her mum, because it's the only time that her mum ever seems to be around. And the mum does this good job. Like, she asks 3 questions to Rose when she arrives. Like, first she asks, is Rose okay? Then she sort of checks that they didn't upset the ward of Montreal, so she's checking that, the family's going to be okay, I guess. And then finally she checks on the books, and because Rose has been really worried that her mum would be upset if she lost this book, because her mum goes to so much effort to get the books. And so it's this almost moment of really good parenting, because like Rosa's mother clearly has the priorities in order. She checks Rose first, then the family, then the books. And then once she finds out all 3 are fine, she just disappears again. So it's sort of this moment of good parenting, but then it's like, oh no, your dad can have you back now, which, his track record's pretty bad so far. And it was also at this point that I remembered that Rose Senior's parents were first cousins that got married, I believe. So, yeah.
Just an interesting family dynamic all around. So at this point, at this point in the story, we don't fully understand the relationship between practitioners and familiars, but kind of drawing on contextual clues, we do understand that they are linked, right? So we do get an interaction, sort of, with Rose Senior and her mother's familiar, who is a snake named Ampelos.
Yeah.
And this is such an interesting part of the story to me, because Ampelos is just sitting there watching her interaction with her dad, watching her kind of blow up and fight with her dad about how early she was awakened. And Ampelos never says anything, never reacts even. But Rose Senior kind of sees Ampelos as mocking her the whole way through this kind of scene.
Yeah, she's constantly talking about how smug he looks. And it's like, I don't know, because Rose Senior's familiar, the black cat, just seemed like a black cat to normal people. So I don't know if practitioners see something else, but I can't help but imagine that it just looks like a snake. And I don't know if you can attribute such emotions to a snake.
It's hard to tell whether it's projection or not, right? Like, Rose Senior is so cognizant of her perceived failures.
It feels like projection, but then also the one thing I do know about familiars so far is that it's like an other who chooses to be your familiar and takes a form. And so I don't know how the form choosing happens exactly, but choosing a snake, in terms of Abrahamic symbolism, does probably mean he's a bit of a dickhead. So I am willing to believe that she may have been right.
Yeah, fair enough. So the next thing that happens, the final diary entry we get, I think, is Rose describing how she got in a fight with Amon Behame, who is one of the presumably ancestors of Laird.
Yeah.
And they fought, and then their fighting went from practitioner fighting to physical fighting, and from physical fighting to physical intimacy, and they end up sleeping together.
And then this is like the first, because she sort of closes this all off by saying, I don't know if he's an enemy or a friend, and I can't trust him. And this is nice. Like, it's like the first emotional clarity she's found, and it's through this weird merger of like we just talked before about how sex was something that was showing how alienated she was from humanity, and so now she manages to have some, but with another practitioner in a really fucked up circumstance that's very practitioner-y. So it kind of feels like this whole message that it's like she finds clarity in this weird hybrid life of being a practitioner with a bit of humanity, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, and I wonder how much Rose Senior differentiates between humans and others, right? Because her philosophy seems to just be treat everybody as though I can't trust them. Treat them as though, they're going to take any opportunity I give to screw me over and do it, which is a methodology that has been explicitly described as how you should deal with others, right? They are tricky. But it seems that Rose kind of, because of how early she awakened, applies this to just all of her relationships.
Yeah, well, and going back to her childhood, she didn't really have any friends because she couldn't make any.
Yeah.
And
I guess her friends were others, yeah.
Yeah, and all the human friends she tried to sort of get together with were, Duchamp women and stuff who, betrayed her and everything. So she never really had a chance to learn to trust humans. And this is the first instance of her really interacting with a human in a good way. And also it's worth noting that Arse Pint was watching the whole thing, just in case you thought it was a romantic moment. A guy named Arse Pint was actually watching it, so it's probably not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, man, this chapter, I just find it sad, I just see this as a tragic chapter.
Oh, yeah, 100%. But at the same time, it so perfectly explains all of Rose's behavior in the start of the arc. You can see how someone, and this is what I love about Wildbow interludes, is he sets someone up as a dickhead, and then you see their backstory, and it just perfectly encapsulates how they ended up that way, and whether or not you'd still say they're a dickhead or whatever. It makes so much more sense that they're like that.
Yeah. They're still a dickhead, but at least I understand why.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I feel like we've kind of touched on all the themes for this chapter already, so we don't really need to loop around again. But she's from being 8 years old all the way up until her death, presumably, she just treats everybody as this person will fuck me over, and that's just kind of her life.
Yeah, well, and again, she couldn't really, we don't know what happened to her parents, but she couldn't turn to the rest of her family as well because she promised to keep her kids out of it. So she didn't even have the rest of her family to lean on once her parents passed away, presumably. We don't know what her situation was in terms of husbands or whatever. But
that's
it
true.
kind of seems like...
Actually...
Yeah, it just kind of seems like the theme of her whole life was it's Rose versus the world.
Yeah. So I think at this point we've reached the end of the first arc.
Yes.
This is the first arc that we've covered on the show, but I think we want to kind of loop back around and talk about the themes of the arc as a whole and how this chapter ties into it. And I think the clue is in the name, Elliot. Bonds. Right?
As you'd expect. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe, why don't you start us off?
Well, I mean, so obviously, I think, bonds is all about connections, like, the bonds that tie you to the world. So, and it's, we've got Blake and his family, Blake and Rose, Blake and his new family is sort of briefly brought up and contrasted with his main one. And then there's also his less concrete or the less interpersonal ones, like Blake becomes bonded to this world of not of parahumans, of practitioners. And he's bonded to the house now. Like he's stuck there, except for like 6 hours a week for this meeting. So, it's all about how we're tied into things and how Blake is tied into stuff.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I want to bring up about this arc is as the start of the arc and this chapter contextualizing it really paint the picture of this is a cycle that has gone on for a countless amount of time, right? The Thorburn family in contest with other practitioners around Jacob's Bell and all this stuff.
Yeah.
This has just been the the way things have been.
And I mean, that's like, we've got Rose talking about stuff happening in the 1930s, and it's all the same family names. Like, she's having issues with Duchamps and Behaims, and they're exactly the names that are coming up that Blake's fighting. So yeah, it's just a very static environment in Jacob's Bell, apparently.
Yeah, and you really can imagine these exact things that happened in 1931 happening today with the younger members of the Thorburn family, and that they would be the exact same.
Yeah, no, it seems like the family reputations back then are exactly the same as what they are now.
But so the one thing I want to bring up about this, though, is the one difference here is Blake's self-made family, right? I think that the fact that Blake broke connections to the Thorburns and made his own new family is so important, like, symbolically, when we're talking about this kind of perpetual cycle, because Blake, I mean, he's here now, he's back again, but at least for a time, that cycle was broken.
Well, and what's interesting is he's gone and made a bunch of human friends and slash family that he will trust, and that's really what's going to differentiate him from Rose Senior. I think is that he has people he can trust, or he's learnt to trust people at some point in his life, which is an experience she never had.
Even Rose Jr. seems to be in the same position that Rose Senior was, where it's like, well, yeah, I just can't trust my family. I can't trust people in general,
Yeah, that's very true.
So if we're kind of taking the first arc and extrapolating, I think the fact that Blake has a new family, that he broke the cycle, gives me some hope that maybe he can break the cycle again.
Yeah. And so tying it all back to that word bonds, the name of the arc, I mean, also there's the concept of a legal bond, which is like an agreement. And obviously that ties in just to the world. Like that's how magic mostly operates in this world. It's all about making pacts and agreements and bonds. So
the other meaning
well.
that I like, I mean, it's so crazy how many meanings these chapter titles seem to have. The other meaning I like is the idea of, like government bonds, right? Like war bonds. The government needs money, and you kind of take out this IOU with somebody or something, and then have to pay it back at a later date, or they pay it back to you at a later date, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's very easy to see that meaning also quite explicitly applies here with the karmic debt that the Thorburn family has
that's true.
built up. Yeah, so many words, they have so many meanings, and they're all seemingly relevant. Even to the extent that I can kind of imagine Wildbow just picks a word and says, what are all the meanings of this word? Now, how can I make them all relevant to this story?
Yeah, it feels like he must have to start with the word because they fit so perfectly.
Yeah. What else do we want to say about this arc? Is there anything else?
I guess as a point of comparison to something like Worm, I just sort of wanted to mention, like, this arc had to do a lot more heavy lifting in terms of exposition, because the world of Pact is a much more involved world. Like, the world of Parahumans kind of relies on a fairly simple premise that's well within the public conscious, which is just superheroes. And Wildbow only really had to explain specific groups as they were introduced or specific things. But for the most part, it was just, hey, it's a world and it has superheroes. You kind of know the basics. Pact's world is much more intertwined and involved. And Wildbow's had to do a lot more in this arc of explaining how things work. And I still feel like we've only gotten a small fraction of the information that we need to really understand how Blake's going to operate. Whereas that wasn't really how I felt one arc into Worm. Yeah,
that's a good point. I guess we will see how he does operate. I see we've got a section in our notes here, Elliot, for predictions.
Oh,
so
yes.
What do you got for us?
Well, I forgot to make some predictions in some previous episodes, so I'm going to play some catch up here. This one seems like a bit of like that we're meant to predict this, so I have a feeling it's going to end up being wrong, but I am just going to stick by it and say that Barbatorum had something to do with creating Miros, because he's been affiliated with mirrors and everything. And he seems like Rose Senior's go-to powerful demon guy. So I wanna predict that, and then my other one. So I was gonna be really clever and predict that Blake would have a bird as his familiar, but then I hopped on the Parahuman subreddit again and noticed Blake's in the header with a bird on his hand. So now I feel like that would be cheating.
Spoilers.
So I'm gonna go ahead and say so I think an other becomes your familiar. So I'm gonna say that he's gonna try and make Rose his familiar to get her out of the mirror. So I'm gonna predict that his familiar will be Mirrose as well.
Okay. 2 predictions there, that Barbatorum is involved with the creation of Rose, and that Rose will become Blake's bird familiar.
Yeah.
And that's the end of Arc 1. Man, it's been a month since we started this show.
Yeah.
We've been going pretty good, I think. But now that we've finished our first arc, we definitely want to kind of check in with you, the audience, and you, Elliot. Check in with you as well, and just see how everyone feels about how the show has been going so far. So we set out to do a kind of specific format where we dive through the chapters. Every few days, dive through each new chapter. But we want to get feedback on some of the other things we've been doing as well. So, for example, we do kind of one bonus thing per episode, whether that's a monster corner or kind of revisiting old comments from 5 years ago, stuff like that. And just get opinions on what stuff you like, what stuff you don't like, what you would like to see more of, less of, or any kind of other ideas that you have for what we could do with the show.
Yeah, I mean, we're very much interested in seeing what everyone else is after out of this podcast. And
now, how can people leave us their comments on those things, Elliot?
Oh, that's a good question, Ruben. The easiest way is to head to mediamdpodcast.com, which has links to our Twitter and Facebook, and it also has a big contact button, which will help you send us an email as well. And so send us ideas to any of those.
You can find a link to do that in the show notes of this here episode. You can also find in those very same show notes a link to our discussion thread for this episode, where we can talk about what everyone thought about Rose Senior's tragic childhood, I guess.
Yes, and we also accept podcast ideas in that thread as well.
Yep.
And so I guess the only other thing to say is that our next episode will be up on Friday the 19th of January, I believe.
I think it's the 18th, but
you're
close.
Right, it is the 18th. You passed my test.
We will be talking about Arc 2 Damages. So join us for 2.1 on the 18th of January, and we will see you then.
See ya.
If you were going to awaken Elliot, what do you think your object would be?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably my laptop.
You got
or
to pick. Yeah, man. Like, that's why I thought the smartphone one in the comments from a few weeks ago was interesting.
Yeah,
it's like shit. Yeah, what do I even
like
have?
A smartphone would be great for the awakening ceremony. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then who are you going to call?
A PS4 controller? I don't even know.